Right, good morning, Greg. How are you doing?
Morning, Sean. Wonderful. You?
Uh, but we were just talking. There are so many stories out at the moment that we could talk about, but time limits us. I think that I definitely want to get into this new China J-36 that's been released. We've seen some pictures flying. It links nicely to Ukraine claiming they're using naval drones to shoot down flanker aircraft. But first of all, I'd like to get into this sort of UK strikes on the Houthis. This is what the Defence Secretary, John Healey, had to say.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday UK forces conducted a joint operation with US allies against a Houthi military facility in Yemen. Our intelligence analysis identified a cluster of buildings 15 miles south of Sana'a used by the Houthis to manufacture drones of the type used to attack ships in the Red Sea and in the Gulf of Aden. Everyone involved in the UK operation has returned to base safely. And I want to thank, on behalf of the House, all members of our armed forces involved in this operation and to pay tribute to them for their total professionalism and their courage.
Yeah, so what struck me about this, not the first time that typhoons have been used like this, but it's been quite some time since the UK has been involved in a strike. And maybe I've missed it in the news, but it doesn't seem like the Houthis have been that active of late. What do you think prompted this? Why now? What was actually, there was no talk about how many typhoons, just it was paid way forwards. What's your take on all this?
Yeah, it's a really good question. It sort of predates Trump when we did the last set of. It may even predate Labour, so this could be Labour's first
I think
interjection.
it's the first time that Keir Starmer's authorised one of these. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think there was a bit of a quiet lull, if you call it that, round there. Partly because of the alleged peace that was breaking out in Gaza and Israel. Of course, that's fallen apart. So I think there was a bit of a hope that the whole thing was going to calm down, but it clearly hasn't. America has had a really big push in the area in the last 2 months, including B2s into Diego Garcia. So they and it's all linked to the talks in Iran, of course, as well. Iran being effectively the proxy support of the Houthis. So yeah, we were, I think, providing Voyager air-to-air refueling in the earlier strikes, but this is the first time we've actually put typhoons over the beach, if you like.
Yeah, and I was just intrigued because they didn't talk last time they talked about was four typhoons, and this time they didn't mention how many typhoons were involved. They did talk about Braithwaite fours, which obviously are the GPS guided or laser guided. And they
Yeah.
talked a lot about the targeting. I think they talked about the target being some for a manufacturing facility of drones. But the one thing that struck me was that in the past, these actions have been sort of reactive. In other words, the Houthis have attacked some shipping, so we've given them some punishment. This time, it
Yeah.
feels like this is more proactive, and
Yeah.
and therefore my brain starts going, hang on a minute, why are they doing this now? Is it intelligence led? Is this an all about messaging to Iran? Particularly because this was attacked at night, trying to minimize civilian casualties, and they made a big thing of that. So
Yeah.
I wonder whether this was actually an attack against the Houthis, or whether that was a symptom. The actual disease was much more focused on Iran.
Yeah, it's always hard to tell when you're not in the room, obviously, when discussions take place, but the timing is interesting. I mean, we've seen America criticize. Well, we saw it on the signal release or release they didn't mean to release, where there was chat about, should we say, other European efforts in the region not pulling their weight. So clearly the UK wants to be seen to pulling its weight. We obviously are trying to retain that special relationship, that ability to stay close to America. Doesn't It's not surprising, of course, there's a trade deal in the offing not far away, so that might be focusing the minds. And of course, we shouldn't forget we've got a rather large task group sailing through the region in the coming weeks. And therefore, preemptive strikes on anything that might threaten that would also be quite a useful thing to do. So, yeah, it has changed slightly. This has all been about freedom of navigation, but we know the shipping's not really going through there anymore. It's going the other way. With tariffs on China, we're not quite sure how much shipping is going to keep flowing, but that's another story.
Yes, I mean they talked about 55%. I think shipping doesn't actually go there now. It doesn't go through the Suez Canal and through the Red Sea. It's actually going around the Horn of Africa.
Yeah.
And I suspect that insurance for these big vessels will not allow the ship to go through there until this whole thing has abated. But you mentioned the carrier strike group. I mean, I can't work out what's going on behind the scenes here, because if you're going to push several billion pounds worth of UK carrier through the Red Sea, you're going to provoke the Houthis first, and then you're going to sail very high profile down through the Red Sea. It's not as if it can be done covertly. It's easy to watch it go through the Suez Canal. It's easy the Red Sea isn't vast, and therefore it almost seems as if it's deliberately provoking the Houthis to have a go at it. I just hope the carrier strike group is very well protected.
Yeah, well, it clearly, it could go another way, it could go somewhere else, but at the moment it's not. It's got to be in Tokyo by the end of August to host a conference, and it's got some exercises in the Indo-Pacific. So we have somewhat telegraphed what's going on, and as you say, you can't go through the Red Sea quietly or stealthily, either satellites or just someone sitting on the banks of the Suez Canal. So they're going to see it coming. So the question for the carrier strike group is, do you go through with the battens hatched, or the hatches battened, and go through as fast as you can using the defences that you've got to your disposal, and nip out the other side quickly? That will be criticised for other reasons. The US will see that as therefore not participating. But if you're going to participate, have you got to stay for a couple of weeks? Because if you just turn up, do one strike and nip out saying, I've done my bit, that will also be criticised. So yeah, it's a really difficult problem to solve, this.
I don't know whether because we've so far, all the strikes we've had against the Houthis, to my knowledge, have been Typhoons, whereas obviously you've got the UK Joint Strike Fighters, the B models on board, whether they will actually use this as an opportunity, because I understand that there's at least one US carrier group in the region as well. There's lots of reports of a second one. And you do think, well, okay, would they take this opportunity to do a joint exercise or a joint operation indeed? And I've not, it just raises so many questions at the moment. And it's a very high risk strategy, it feels to me, to put a non-combat ready carrier. Most of the crew on the carrier, when they first get on for these sorts of long journeys, very few of them are actually combat ready. They have to work up their capability. So how well trained will they be? How well equipped will the carrier be? And would it be wise, with the benefit of hindsight, to put it into that sort of risk? I don't know. It'd be really interesting to see, and whether the US actually do some sort of joint operation in the Red Sea so that both the carrier groups are working together.
Yeah, I mean, excuse the pun, but we are between the devil and the deep blue sea here. I mean, to not use it sort of implies that it doesn't have any relevance against a relatively benign threat. I mean, the Houthis are shooting things down and still shooting things back, but they're hardly, a peer in that regard. We know the Americans have lost at least half a dozen Reaper drones. We know they've lost 2 F-18s, albeit not to enemy action, but whilst engaged with the enemy. So those have been mishaps, as the Americans call them, or incidents. So this isn't without risk. Now, the Carrier Strike Group has just started what's called Mediterranean Strike. It's an exercise in the Mediterranean with other NATO forces looking at exactly these types of operations. So they will at least, and I'm sure they are seeing it almost as a mission rehearsal. It may well be that no one's made a decision yet. All options are on the table, and I think politics will develop over the coming weeks, and the geopolitical situation will dictate. My gut feel is they're going to be putting everything up to protect the ship. It's not far away then from doing strikes if you're fired at, and the idea that the Houthis will just let the strike group go through untouched is somewhat fanciful. So you do sense here that something's going to happen. The question is it on our terms or theirs?
And the other, obviously, dynamic is that we're hearing the news as we sit here that the Prime Minister Netanyahu in Israel has decided that he seems to be abandoning peace plans and focused on actually invading Gaza and providing a semi-permanent basis there. And if that's the case, then to date, Iran's proxies, Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis have all been, found the fuel of all of this to get involved. And therefore, given that that's just been announced, you'd imagine that the Iranians would have been pouring money, weapons, etc., into the Houthis to go, right, get on with it. And therefore, this would be quite a high-profile way of Iran demonstrating that it's standing firm with Hamas in Gaza. All these are just linked, aren't they?
Yeah. Well, that is definitely true. I mean, the situation in Israel and Gaza clearly is not a great one. I mean, that situation is only getting worse. And therefore, any linkage to that is going to play. We saw a recent arrest in the UK of terrorists allegedly are linked to Iran. You know, all these things are linked. We mustn't forget either that behind Iran and behind the Houthis, you don't have to look very far for Russia or China either. And you can see that Russia would see this as a great opportunity to stick a divide between the UK and the US, for example. So rather than focusing on the US ships and carriers, why not focus on the UK one? So yeah, there are many people who argue that ships are immune to geopolitical situations. It's only airfields and armies that have to worry about such things. Ships can sail the oceans free from any interference. That is clearly not true in this region, and clearly not true when you get that close to the land. So, yeah, this is going to be an interesting few weeks, no doubt about it.
Yeah, we'll keep ourselves across it. Right. And Brett, can I also ask you, as a sort of fellow fighter pilot, one of the things that caught my eye in the news was this J-36, this Chinese new 6th generation jet. It looked really weird. Not only has it got 3 engines with an intake on the top of it, but without a tail, you know, you sort of go, okay, what's this all about? It looked a little bit like a B-2 copy, but actually it also didn't. You know, is this really a credible threat? Is this China experimenting? Is it, you know, do we have to worry about it? What does all this mean?
Yeah, it's the race to 6th gen, isn't it? Although I think you and I would violently agree that these generational terms can fall apart a little bit sometimes. I think what's really been interesting this time is this time China seems ahead. The US delayed the NGADs, the next generation air dominance. Now the F-47. We've got Tempest on the books, but still waiting really for the full green light on that. But lots of work still ongoing, whereas this thing is airborne and flying around. And it doesn't look like a carbon copy, which is a bit of a Chinese thing to do. Either get your hands on the blueprints or take a few dodgy photographs off the internet, and next thing you know, they've built an aeroplane. This does look different, and I think is indicative of how far China is now getting with its technology and actually putting it into practice ahead of the pack, which is unusual, whereas previously they've been good copycats.
So I remember, I don't know if you're a fan of Top Gear, but I do remember watching Top Gear, and they did a thing about Chinese cars some time ago, and they were all copies of Western cars and pretty poor copies. But they concluded that actually it wouldn't be long before China was actually going ahead and no longer having to copy. It's learned it. They've been putting people into our universities, into our industry. And I do wonder, this aircraft, we only got fleeting footage of it flying over, you know, on mobile phone footage or whatever. But these things are inherently very unstable, aren't they? You flew in an aircraft with a massive great tail fin because you want it like a dart. You want the back end to be pointing backwards and the pointed end pointing forward. And if you don't have that big control surface at the back, the danger is it becomes incredibly unstable. So the very fact this thing is fly by wire, it's not just looking good, it has to actually be very clever inside as well, doesn't it?
Yeah, I don't think many people realize this. I mean, most modern aircraft these days don't fly. They're not aerodynamic in the traditional sense. They need the computers, they need the fly-by-wire system to basically keep the thing stable. In fact, they're better if they're inherently unstable because it makes them more maneuverable. They're able to change direction quicker. This is really about stealth. This is about keeping the number of vertical or even horizontal surfaces to the absolute minimum. And even the ones that you do end up having, you change the shape of them, you put absorbent material on them, everything to move that radar signature down into the very small sizes so that you can't be seen. Interestingly, they've got a third engine and the intake is above the aircraft. So that's unusual. We haven't seen that. I'm trying to think of airplanes that are even remotely like that. Certainly not jet aircraft. And that means, you know, you're hiding the temperature signature as well. So there's lots of things going on there with that airplane.
I also wonder, though, it's one thing copying. So we've seen the, you know, various different copies of Western tech. It's quite another to actually understand the technology within it. You and I both flew aircraft where electronic warfare, defensive countermeasures, radars, all those sorts of things, they're not easily visible from outside, and therefore not a lot more difficult to copy. Do we get any sense that this, next gen aircraft is also going to have next gen capability? Because as you bantered, I mean, this next gen thing, people regularly ask me, what does it mean? What does 6th gen mean? And I go, well, it's slightly more integrated, and in a way, I guess the simple way is to make it easier for the pilot to gain situational awareness, because you've got more and more stuff coming in. How do you synthesize that to make it easier? And that's all about computers. It's all about technology. Well, one thing China is good at is computers and technology. So I wonder whether this is an indication of them actually getting genuinely on parity or ahead with some of the stuff in an aircraft that really counts.
I think it does. And I think you only have to look broader in China. And electric cars is not a bad example, actually, of how their technology is now getting to be at the cutting edge. Now, if they can do that in things like cars, electronics, or other things, and keep the costs down and mass produce, as we know they can, if they can put that type of technology into an aircraft, then they really are talking a game changer. You and I know this, but a lot of people get excited at air shows about which airplane goes the fastest and which one does the biggest, smallest loop and all that stuff. It's all very clever and great for air shows, but that's not how you win air combat these days. It's do you see the other person before they see you, and do you engage them quicker than they can engage you? And that happens tens, probably now hundreds of miles apart. So, that's where the battle is won these days. I think that's why we're seeing these aircraft. The J-36 is a really good example. I think F-47 Tempest is going to be exactly the same. These aren't small fighters. I mean, I've heard people call them super cruisers. I mean, they are literally, battleships designed to go very, very deep and control other aircraft, probably unmanned drones. And therefore, they need long range, high payload. These are not the small little fighters that we've come to know and love over the years. These are beasts.
Do you think, though, I mean, it raises an interesting question, because Tempest wasn't generally labeled as a 6th gen aircraft, whereas NGAD, next generation air dominance from the US, was definitely 6th gen. And it looks like the Chinese are doing that. Is there a danger that we are slipping behind with our ambition?
Yeah, I mean, if we just use the generation numbers, they're crude, we know that, but let's just use them. So we've got a 4th generation aeroplane in Typhoon that is very good. It's at the top end of the 4th generation capability. It's highly agile, great performance, but very little stealth, and relies on sheer brute force in some respects to overcome that. The F-35 was the 5th generation aircraft we chose. We'd made that in partnership with Lockheed Martin, but it's an American aircraft. So Tempest is a generational leap for Europe. And so we're going from 4th to 6th with only sort of buying 5th gen off the shelf elsewhere. And that's where the challenge comes. I mean, there's a fine line between 5th and 6th gen. In fact, Lockheed Martin, I think, only recently announced, was it a NASCAR upgrade on the F-35, which allowed them to, if you like, try and build a gap into that, or fill the gap in the market between 5th and 6th, as you would expect them to. So, the areas are getting blurred. It is about the sensors and the systems. That is where you truly make a difference. And, of course, the weapons that you end up employing.
But I guess my point is that the cost of these programs, I think it was it $20 billion signature for the F-47? That was just a production thing. All the development costs, they are absolutely massive. And therefore, when we generated the Typhoon, we only ever aimed, we were saying less than 1,000 of them. And I think the order numbers fell. And of course, the fewer you produce, the more expensive per copy they have to be, and the compromises you have to make. It's also about jobs. So as soon as you're in partnership, everybody wants a little bit of the pie. And it does raise an interesting question. Do you, I know it sounds flippant, but do you do a Tempest like, because it's more focused on European jobs, you may not get as good as the next generation fight you could get from America, but at least it's jobs and capability? Or should you be in partnership with America, as we were with the F-35? Is it about capability? Is it about jobs? Is it about bang for buck? I don't think there's an answer, but it's where do you put that pin in the donkey for this discussion?
I think it's a question for the SDR, and I know that Labour are not agonising over this, but they're doing the sums. I mean, ultimately, they want to get a capability that the Air Force needs, and more importantly, will win or deter the other side. So it needs to be good enough. But the real question is what investment does that bring into the country in terms of jobs, as you rightly say? Now, there is very strong arguments that show that the money does come back and gets reinvested, either through wages or skills and R&D downstream. The real money winner, of course, is export, and that's the main reason why Tempest is in partnership. Because if you're the only customer, you're not going to buy enough. So yeah, you want to be able to sell that product as far and wide as possible. It's highly likely that the Americans might not sell F-47 export. They obviously have with F-35. They didn't with the F-22. They just didn't want to give away the technology. Donald Trump has admitted that he might be doing a 10% cut down on it. I don't think he meant price either. He just meant so. Is that where GCAP Tempest steals a bit of a march and becomes an exportable model that offers all the bells and whistles to your trusted partners and allies? So yeah, the economics of this is definitely a factor. It isn't just about what do we need militarily. Ideally, you square both problems.
I was interested because that the fun bit on this for me was that economic argument, because there clearly is a big push at the moment in America to try and get this next generation air dominance aircraft, and all the lobby groups, the Congress or whatever. Whenever in my grey hair and in my history of watching all this stuff, generally speaking, when there's a big lot of discussion about funding, suddenly in the news appears a new project that is the justification for it. And you do wonder whether Chinese J-36, America's will have known about this project for many, many years. Is it now hitting our screens? Because actually that demonstrates that America isn't necessarily at the forefront of technology. It scares the Congress into going, come on, we need to put the money behind this, and therefore justifying the funds for this next generation air dominance aircraft.
Yeah, I think there's three factors at play. I think the J-36 is a game changer because it demonstrates you can't stand still. You keep buying F-35s till the cows come home, but if they can't compete with the J-36, you're betting on the wrong horse. We've obviously seen an increasing reluctance to think about buying American because of the concerns of things being turned off or supply chains being broken. So that is also a factor, which then gets Europe questioning, okay, so what do we need to do internally? And that's the challenge here. We've got GCAP and FCAS, the sort of French-German model. That's 2 sixth-generation airplanes on the books within Europe alone. Now, wouldn't it be great if those could be joined up? The problem we have, of course, is the French want a carrier-based version, which probably limits the size that these are. Although, interestingly, I think the J-36 is allegedly going to have a carrier version, but they do make big carriers in China, so maybe they've got the room for it.
It's one thing saying you'll make it for that, but I know with the F-35, having been intimately involved in that, when they wanted one family of aircraft. When you tried to land the F-35B on a carrier, it was going to, the A model on a carrier, it was going too fast. So you needed a bigger wing to slow it down. And of course, a bigger wing and obviously a tail hook meant that you had to redesign it. And all of a sudden, a family of aircraft that should have been the same. You've got the C model, which has a significantly bigger wing and more fuel, goes further, but so they can operate off the carrier. So as soon as it might sound, let's just operate off the carrier. It sounds like a passing phrase, but it can add a hell of a lot of cost.
Yeah, well, the J-36 has got a pretty big wing, but it hasn't got any control surfaces. So, the idea that you can maneuver the airplane that quickly, although interestingly, I mean, here's a good story. I mean, the F-18, for example, even when I used to fly it back in the 90s, had an auto landing system, and you could couple it to the carrier and you just took your hands off. But no self-respecting carrier pilot would land hands off, would they? Pretty scary thing to do anyway. But in putting the human into the loop, you end up landing plus or minus 30, 40, 50 feet, whereas a machine will just keep putting it down on the same spot. And there was an argument that it was the humans that were damaging the decks and they should just let the machine take over. So, we are able to do auto landings on carriers. So maybe there is technology that makes all this a lot simpler.
I'd forgotten about that because my life on a carrier, I think some of my most dangerous landings were on carriers. But then we were landing slightly differently. You guys like to land and then slow down, whereas we like to slow down and then land.
Although on a carrier, you slow down pretty quick.
On that, I think we'll leave that one there.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think one of the bigger things about the J-36 and the F-47 and Tempest is their ability to work in tandem with uncrewed systems, the so-called collaborative combat aircraft. UK's just announced the Storm Shroud aircraft, which has been used in Ukraine to be part of that sort of that family, if you like, of systems. But you know, and I know that drones are still developing, and we're yet probably to see the type of technology that we're expecting to see operating at 6th generation. But only in the last few days have we seen Ukraine yet again break the glass ceiling of drone technology and drone warfare in shooting down a flanker from an unmanned boat, of all things, which has just been incredible.
Yeah, this was amazing news. I mean, let's be also a little bit clear that this is a media war in Ukraine. I've always look at everything I hear with a degree of skepticism, but even the Russians have admitted that, they've lost a couple of aircraft. There was talk about shooting down one or two of these Russian Su-30 flanker aircraft. It turns out that 3 Magura V7 naval drones were involved. These are not particularly fast. They're very agile, normally packed full of explosive and drive them at ships. That seems to be what they were normally doing. But at this time, they seem to have put a couple of missiles on them. Initially, I think they were using the Ukrainian P-73, I think it is, weapon called Sea Dragon. But my understanding is these were old Sidewinders that were put on board that you and I used to fly with regularly. Yeah. Got a picture of one here. I think a couple of things that I would just causes me questions. When you look at very closely at the picture here, there is still the caps on the end. Remember when we used to go flying and you had to take the seeker cap off, which protects the seeker head? These have still got them on, and you think it's a pretty hostile environment in a little fast patrol boat against salty. I'm not quite sure how you'd keep the front clean all that time, and also how the hell would you aim them? So I do think there's some interesting questions that crop up from this.
Yeah, they had been putting Russian missiles on the aircraft, and the Russian missile, I think they had a capability to slew the head off the bore sight. So you could basically, without having to move the ship, you could slew the head of the missile to look off angle, if you like. The 9 Mike, the AIM 9 Mike, apparently didn't have that capability on this particular one. So if you look at the ship, you can see that it's elevated. So the thing's sort of pointing into the sky, I don't know, 15 degrees up. And all you're looking for, and the ranges of a 9 Mike, even off an aircraft, which is flying at 500-600 miles an hour, is in single digit miles. Fired off the back of a ship, we really are talking single digit miles. So you're talking about 5, 6, 7 miles maximum range. So you've literally got to steer your ship to point 15 degrees up at a range inside 5 to 6 miles and find a heat signature, identify it as a bad guy, and then pull the trigger. So it's pretty basic. Everyone's saying, "Oh, this is amazing." It is literally strapping something on and just literally pointing in the right direction and then pulling the trigger and hoping it hits. But it has hit.
Yeah, but you and I mean, we both. I mean, not very often, but whenever air-to-air missiles were getting life-exed, we go off to fire them, wouldn't we? Off near Valley, and we'd go off to a range, and you'd fire off this sidewinder at a drone that was towing and it was all very, very contrived, but you had a very stable aircraft that was pointing it was trying to detect, and then it was suddenly picked up, you'd unlock it, and you sort of think all of that needed. Well, last time I was watching these little boats at sea, they're bobbing around all over the place. I mean, how on earth you would get any sort of solution from that? Now, so it felt to me that far more likely was that there were external sensors that were identifying the aircraft, and this was potentially just a weapon delivery system that launched it, and then either after launch, somehow, whether it was data linked or something, said, "Look over here."
Yeah. I mean, if you look at the geography, it's a long way from home. These were right on the other side of the Black Sea, sort of on the bit of Russia, away from Crimea to the east. So it's unlikely that they had sensors seeing that far. They could have had someone sat on the coast, because this was quite close to the coast. which is in itself remarkable that Russia was allowing these little ships to be that near to their own territory. But you could have had people sat there with binoculars. You could have had all sorts. We know there's a video on the ship, and therefore there probably is a human in the loop. So there is some interaction going on. But yeah, if anyone's ever seen a Sidewinder up close, they're not that high tech these days. So you probably can, on an air show, maybe even see what's known as a training one. The head looks rather opaque, but when you look through it, you can just see the tiny little head, and it's a tiny little piece of electronics bouncing around. And you're right that on a motorboat, in a few waves, that is going to be getting some serious banging around. So yeah, I don't think we're there yet in killer boats having a 360-degree vision and being able to do all sorts of things. I think this is a bit of a guerrilla raid that they've pulled off. Whether Russia gets wise now and thinks a little bit more carefully about where it's flying, at what height it's flying, and what's on the sea beneath it, you might not see another one for a while. But yeah, they have definitely upped the game. There's no doubt about it. I think the Magura, I think this is version 7, V7. So there are 6 previous models, and you're right. The previous ones were used literally just to steer into a ship and blow up. This is another step up from that. But let's be brutally honest. A sailor with a Stinger missile on a rubber boat would do the same thing. Whether you want to sail a rubber boat that far, I don't know. But that's the level of technology we're talking here. It's quite basic, but it's definitely a new development.
And what I loved about it was that, and so we you and I both know. I mean, it's 2 basic missiles that we'd fire. We'd either fire radar missiles or infrared missiles. The huge difference of the radar missile warns the aircraft that you're firing at that there's something coming towards it, because your radar is bouncing signals off the aircraft. The infrared missiles are passive, so all they're doing is picking up a heat signature, and therefore you wouldn't know they were coming unless you have some very sophisticated equipment on board. And as you say, this was conducted a long way away from anywhere that the Russians would have thought that they were in any sort of trouble. And I think for me, this is just fantastic asymmetric warfare. You're not going to win a war like this, but taking out 2 Russian aircraft. Apparently one of the crews survived, the other crew didn't survive. And all of that just gets everybody just a little bit more nervous about what's going on around the battlefield. And how they develop this capability, because as you said, Sidewinders traditionally come off the wings of an aircraft traveling at 500 miles an hour. They've already got lots of aerodynamics before they head off. You imagine, right, we're going to launch them off a little boat. And you imagine them coming off the rails and just dropping into the ocean because they haven't got any flying speed. Just the whole thing must have been a fantastic bit of high-tech ingenuity. And I think that's what I really love about what Ukraine's doing. They seem to be unbottling ingenuity, less worried about trials, less worried about safety and security, because quite bluntly, they just need to get this stuff done. And they're doing some pretty impressive stuff.
Yeah, you imagine us trying to get the trials clearance to go and do this in Apaport. It is. I mean, we don't know how many failures they've had previously, but this was quite a few successes. I think it was a helicopter as well. This was quite a lot in a very short space of time. But if I was Ukraine, you think, I'm only going to get away with this once. We may as well go full on here and try and get as many as possible while we catch them unawares. You remember when we...
You say that, but if you can put them on the back of boats, you can put them on the back of trucks. Yeah. If you put them on the back of trucks, suddenly, so normally you and I, when you're flying, you're looking for air threats. Surface-to-air missiles maybe, but you're looking for air threats. Now, if you've got these things driving around in trucks and back of flatbed trucks, which would be easier to launch. Now all of a sudden you raised a very real issue that I wonder what the other thing. So Loyal Wingman, you're probably closer to this than I am. This whole idea of Tempest and the next generation about being a mastercraft and then lots of drones. Is this sort of philosophically how that's going to work? That the master aircraft is sharing data and then you've got all these loyal drones running off and doing their thing?
Yeah, I absolutely where I think it's headed. I mean, there was a really good Inside Air podcast the other day that was linked via the Team Tempest podcast site. So for those that have followed those, you'll see it was only last week, which talked about the 6th gen aircraft, the J-36, the F-47 or the Tempest, effectively being a quarterback. I know it's an American football analogy, but I think it's well watched enough these days for people to understand. So you've got the manned aircraft, crewed aircraft sat at the back, controlling or dictating the tactics of all the other bits and pieces, most of which could be uncrewed. They could be jamming, they could carry EW systems, they could be decoying by just literally acting as targets. They could be carrying weapon systems, so you take more mass into the fight. And effectively, the quarterback sat in the 6th gen aircraft is orchestrating this battle a long, long way from home and possibly a long, long way from data links, but is able then to still control them even in a sort of contested EW environment. So this is where air power is going. Some people think it's a binary choice. It's crewed versus uncrewed. The current thinking, and it would appear China are no different, is it's going to be a blend. It's going to be less people in the loop or on the loop, but you're still going to need humans quite a long way into enemy territory in order to control all these moving parts, because you won't be able to rely on the electronic magnetic spectrum. So, yeah.
Do you think we're going to, you and I, maybe we just weren't that talented, but found it difficult enough to control a single military jet with everything else going on. It's years of experience. Now you've got to try and extend that situational awareness, not only to your aircraft, but to a whole load of other platforms around you. There's going to have to be a step change in the way that we train our air crew and how we manage that workload on them, because frankly, we've recruited some pretty awesome individuals to do the job today. This does feel it's going to be another step in terms of requirement.
Yeah, and I think this is where artificial intelligence is going to play such a key part. The ability of the sensors and the system to present to you choices, and then you merely select the strategy or the level of risk, and then the machine tells the systems which bits to go where first. I think the analogy I've just thought of is, in the good old days, we were just a pawn on the chessboard. Now we're going to have the chessboard on our lap, and we'll be playing chess whilst flying at 1.5 Mach, and try and control all the other moving parts. But we're going to have machines helping us do it along the way. I think that's the way this is headed. But you still have that moral and ethical link through the human who's making those decisions on risk and is able to judge whether, because I think that's the big thing here. If that drone the other day, the Ukrainian drone, had accidentally shot down a Russian airliner, we'd be having a different conversation right now. And how good is their ID capability? How much do you trust the algorithm in the machine to discriminate between a Su-30 and an airliner? Well, that's relatively easy to do. What about a civilian helicopter and a military helicopter? This starts to get difficult. And we are, letting machines make those decisions for us is where we're all agonizing about where this goes.
It's also just how critical, if you've got one, as you say, very expensive, large military jet with an incredibly highly trained pilot looking after this swarm, then all of a sudden that pilot and that aircraft becomes even more of a target, doesn't it? Because take that out and suddenly you've taken the hub of that full new capability out. It'll be a fascinating one for us to follow, because I'm yet to understand in my head where the logic of this flows. It does feel incredibly difficult. And you and I both know firsthand that, situational awareness is absolutely key in all of this. You've got to make sure your aircrew guy is on top of it, and also on top of the whole 3-dimensional game of chess, 4-dimensional game of chess. Yeah. And it just feels that it's one thing what technology can do. It's another whether the human can actually keep up with it.
Yeah, and I think that links to the real fundamental question. Just because technology can do something doesn't necessarily mean you want to do it, or you morally are comfortable doing it. So I think it is the moral and ethical arguments here that are going to become sort of more prescient. We still struggle over driverless cars. And the reason we struggle over driverless cars is we'll probably react more to an accident by a driverless car than some idiot who doesn't drive very well. Because that's just human error and accidents happen. Machines, that's terrible. We need to lock up the software engineer. So it's interesting, isn't it, that we really do struggle ethically with driverless cars. The technology's there, but we and the argument is they are safer. I'm not sure if that is provable. We've had all sorts of issues in the US where, of course, they're rather litigious. So I think we're going to test things out there. But yeah, this is the real question, fundamental question for us, because there are now plenty of politicians. I saw some recently in the papers over the weekend saying, this is the future. We are all going to be sat in a bunker controlling machines. I think the movie was called Terminator.
On that note, Greg, thanks very much for a great episode. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. All the best.